Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Power Law Investor. Today is August 30th, 2024, and we'll be discussing the power law in regards to Kaspa. Specifically, what is it, how is it applicable to Kaspa, and why you should care. I try and keep my videos pretty short, and if you like the content and it's helpful, please like and subscribe. So the power law name itself is a little confusing. So let's spend a few minutes discussing what it is, okay? Let's understand first what a trend line is. As the name suggests, the trend line is simply the trend of the data. What direction is the data heading? Can we explain the general direction or the general way the data is varying by some sort of trend? Normally it's a line, hence the name trend line. So let's take a look at this graph below. Right, for now, don't worry about the axis. Just notice that the x-axis over here represents some measure of time, and the y-axis over here is some measure of price. We've transformed it in some sort of way, but don't worry about that right now. All right, so the trend line over here, as you can see, this data is bouncing around. Let me switch to a different color. It's a little bit easier to see. Trend line is bouncing around, or the data is bouncing around, but we have this trend line, the orange line, which is explaining what is the general direction in which the data is going. Okay, and there are three key parameters that we get out of this. It's highlighted over here. Okay. Now, the first two elements here, the 4.06 and the minus 12.79, they are parameters of the equation. A straight line can be represented by an equation y is equal to mx plus minus b, in which case here m, which is the slope of the line, how steep it is, and the minus 12.79, which is just some measure of intercept or how much is offset relative to the x-axis or upon the y-axis, depending on the way of looking at it. So the more important term here is the 4.06, which is called the exponent, and you'll see why in a minute. And the r squared, this value underneath, is an important factor because it says, in this case, what percentage of the variation in price is explained by this line. So it's saying these ups and downs and how it's generally moving, how much of that is explained by this line. If it was 1, r squared goes between 0 and 1. 0 means there's no explanatory power. And 1 means that it explains it perfectly. So in this case, 0.95 is about 95% of the variation in the data is explained by this r squared value. Or sorry, this is explained by this line. Okay, and another thing to notice here also is that we're looking at the number of days of data. So that's 822 data points that we have. So that's a little over two and a half years or so. Okay, so what this is telling us is that if we transform the data in this way, which we should discuss shortly, we can draw this straight line through the data, and that line explains 95% of the variations in that data. That means it has a very high predictive power, that if I give you the equation, you're generally going to end up pretty close to what value the transformed price data is. Okay, so that's the first part. Now let's understand what logarithms are. That can be a little confusing, so we'll just jump onto this whiteboard here. That'll help us understand. Normally, when we represent data, we represent it by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's what we're all really familiar with. It's called the logarithmic, it's called the linear way of looking at things. It's simply you double the distance and it's twice the value. But we also have another way of looking at data, which is called logarithmically, or transforming the data in a logarithmic way, in which, in this case, each step, the increase is by a factor of 10. So that means when you double the distance, you increase by a factor of, so every step you increase by a factor of 10. And what this allows us to do is express relatively larger quantities than in linear graphs. So in the normal graph, you can see that it would only go from 1 to 6. But over here in the logarithmic graph, you've gone all the way from 1 to 100,000. That allows us to see how things are at the smaller scale and also at the larger scale. All right. And now this becomes important because if we come back to our regular programming over here, that's how we transform this data. So that's what this log 10 days means and the log 10 price means. So when we convert it from this logarithmic way of looking at things into the linear way of looking at things, things start curving in a very interesting way. Let's jump on that. And this data, this linear data ends up looking like this. Now we have the same equations, the same parameters of these equations, the 4.06, but now it's showing up as this power, x raised to 4.06. We still have the minus 12.79, and it's showing up as 10 raised to the power minus 12.79. And again, we have the same number of valid days, and the power law R squared fit derived from this linear estimation on this graph over here is, is showing up here as 0.9549. And this is important to understand that this is not technical analysis. This is a mathematically derived and replicable way of finding a trend in the data. Coming back to this graph, the reason why this is so powerful and why we would care is because this line does an amazingly great job of describing the price data over time. This is very unusual because most other securities that you would see, stock prices, would not be able to be described by a line with a simple equation like this. The simplicity is beauty. And in a sense, we've reduced how the price is trending over time to this simple equation over here. Right? That's when we start getting quite excited, those of us who think this is something unusual, because admittedly, this is now in the past, but could we also use this same equation to predict what prices will do in the future? And if that's the case, then we can build investment decisions around that. And that's why the power law gets so exciting, not only for Kaspa, but more importantly and more prevalently for Bitcoin, because there are very few securities that follow this sort of trend, that have such a high R squared fit. And to my knowledge, only Bitcoin and Kaspa have the ability, show this sort of behavior, that the R squared is such a high number. So it's explained in so phenomenally well. And I've looked at the top 1,000 cryptocurrencies, done the analysis myself, and Bitcoin and Kaspa are the only two cryptos that follow this particular law. Now, there may be others that I'm unaware of, but as far as I know, this is useful. And then, moving on is, why do we care about it? Because we can make investment decisions on it. Moving on to the next slide, you'll see that just using the simple equation that we have over here, we can actually end up making predictions on what we think is going to happen over the next 6 and 12 months. So for here, the top box simply says that right now it's below the trend, but if it were on trend, it would have a trend value of 0.26. And as I speak, Kaspa has a value of about 16.5 cents. So the discount to trend is about 36%. But if Kaspa continues to follow the trend and it hits the trend line, in about 6 months, it would return 209% For every dollar you'd put in, you'd walk away with $2 of profit. And if you continued that for an additional year, for every dollar that you put on, for a year that's total from where we are today, we'd end up with a return of about 452%. So for every dollar you're putting in, that's $4.50 back. Now, again, this is not investment advice, and this is a mathematical construct that we can use to predict what happens in the future if things continue on the same way as they have in the past. Now, there are no guarantees, but it is a phenomenally good fit. So that'll give you guys some flavor of why people have been talking so much about this power laws. The power law is just a way to describe this particular relationship in which y is equal to x raised to some power times some coefficient. But we think there's a good possibility that what's happened in the past could continue in the future. Again, not investment advice, but you guys get the general idea of how this could be going forward. So again, if you have comments or suggestions, please put them in the comments below. I'd appreciate getting a community going around this and people with different questions, and we'll help to try and answer them as best as I can. And again, support the channel by liking and subscribing. Thank you so much for your time.